switching to English now because we have international guests with us today. So at my side is Sophia Helston from Acast. You are the director of Acast Creative EU. You're a marketing professional and you are in charge of Acast brand partnerships and ad format developments. I'm so glad that you came to Munich. Thank you for being here. And you will share with us your thoughts on different advertising formats in podcast and trends in podcast advertising. I'm very curious to know about that in the EU and about advertisement creation in podcasts. So the stage is for you, and we're really curious to know all about that.
Thank
Sophia.
you. Apologize if I'm a little tone deaf as regards to what's been said before. My German is not perfect, so I might repeat something that's been said, but then you'll have to bear with me. Great. So I'm here a little bit to talk about ads that listeners love and how to think a little bit more creatively about podcast advertising. But before I jump into that, I want you all to close your eyes, just for a minute, and listen. It's quite extraordinary what you notice when you're deprived of your primary sense, which is sight. And it's not very, strange because the environment we live in is overwhelmingly visual in its nature. And with it, it's very, very easy to overlook the oral importance and the oral elements of a brand or of a business. But what is becoming more and more evident, I think, for many of you who are watching today, is that we have to start to shift our focus from an eyeballs-only approach to an approach where audio gets an equal amount of care and attention. And that's a little bit what I'm here to talk to you about today, about how brands can actually talk to listeners within podcasts, as well as some current trends in how to use podcast as a marketing media. But before we jump into that, I just want to throw this fact at you. The human body can hear faster than it can see, taste, smell, or feel. That's quite incredible. So it takes 0.05 seconds for the ear, from sound to go from the ear to the brain. That's 4 times as fast as your sight or your touch. And of course, this is our evolutionary shaped emergency response system. So this is designed to, help us survive out in nature. And our ears, they are on high alert, whether we want it or not. But I'm not here to talk about the human body and evolution. I'm, of course, here to talk about podcasting, more specifically. And podcasting, it started out and still is a place for telling stories. May they be long or may they be short. And over the years, they have opened up for different formats for monetization and for different formats for brands to tell their stories in this very, very intimate space. So I thought I'd start with covering some of the more overarching formats for advertising within podcasts that are available today. Let's start with the OG, the host reads, or sponsorships, as they're also known as. You've all heard them probably, this classic, this week we're sponsored by, followed by 60 to 90 seconds of a personal endorsement from the podcast host. And there are as many executions to these as there are podcasts. We've had people write whole songs, beatbox their way through a host read, or even, quiz each other on the features of a certain product, and many, many more. But what we do have learned over the years is that the best reads are the ones where brands dare to step back and allow podcasters to do what they do best, namely talk to their audience. Secondly, a little bit of a runner-up, the ads. So this is the 30-second ad creative that can be run pre, mid, or post a podcast episode. And this has been also, I would say, driven a little bit by the dynamic ad insertion technology that was launched by Acast back in 2014. because this is a way of scalably reaching out with your message to many, many listeners. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about ads later, and specifically how to think about creation of an ad specifically for the podcast media. So I'm not going to stay any longer on that now, but I'll instead jump over to the third format that I want to cover, which is branded content. And this can take so many forms and shapes. But it is a format that is becoming more and more popular among brands, and this is a format where you can either, create something from scratch by yourself and using this fantastic space that is someone sitting with a pair of headphones on, listening and giving their full attention to the content. Or it can be collaborating with an already existing podcast. And this kind of is a quite good segue into one of the trends I did want to cover today, which is longer formats. So long-form branded content is something that we've seen grow quite a lot over the past years in many markets. And as I mentioned, the nature of podcasting is this, telling of a story. So it's quite perfect for a brand also to be able to go in and tell a longer story about a phenomenon, about a cause, about something that they or you as a brand want to highlight. And the creative possibilities are, of course, endless here. You can do anything from, collaborating with an existing podcast. May you be a online dating brand and you collaborate with a lifestyle podcast to create a series of episodes on how to date through a pandemic. Or maybe you are a bank. You want to collaborate with a pop science podcast to teach listeners about why it is so hard for us to think about our financial future and the tips and tricks to get into start to save. Or you do like Samsung in Australia. You create your own podcast where you interview interesting and more or less famous Australians that are bending the rules in everyday life. So the format has so many opportunities. Sky is the limit. And it's not only that the creative possibilities are endless when it comes to longer form branded content within podcasts. I could go on and on about that, given the nature of what I do for a living. But the fact is that this is something that we see both listeners and advertisers are being more and more attracted to. During 2020, we saw an increase in investments in branded content at Acast globally of 150%. And looking at how people actually, or how listeners engage with this kind of content, we see that branded episodes have an average of a 90% listen-through rate, which is on par with general content that we release on our platforms. And look at a branded podcast specifically. If we look at the branded podcast that we host within the realms of Acast, the average listening time on these are 28 minutes. 28 minutes is quite a long time that a listener willingly spends with your brand and the brand messaging that you want to convey, especially if you compare it to the very, very short media attention span that we all have today. So that was the first trend. The second creative trend that I did want to cover is 3D audio. Maybe you've heard about it, maybe you have heard it. I can't really illustrate it to you in this room here, so I urge you all to, when you get home or when you get off your computer, or maybe get into a new tab on your computer, put on a pair of headphones and go on and Google some 3D audio experience and listen to it, because it has to be experienced. And basically, why 3D audio is a trend specifically within podcasting is the nature of how we consume podcasts. We consume podcasts through headphones for the major part of the time. And this is quite different from other audio media, and it makes the use of 3D audio actually possible. So as a brand, what you can do with this is to take a listener on a 30 or up to 30-second journey of placing them at a scene or in a room where a story is taking place. Sound can come from the left, from the right, from above, from behind. And it's a fantastic tool for creating emotion and really build, you know, that sense of, or the feeling of that I, as a listener, I'm there, I'm at the scene, I'm where everything is happening. And this, you know, it can be, let's say, a speaker brand trying to illustrate how the audio experience differs depending on where in the room you place a speaker. Or it can be a Christmas campaign where actually Santa Claus steps into your living room and gives presents to your whole family, and you get to be there in that moment. So do plug in your headphones and try this out when you get off this. And this is not only, you know, a gimmick or something that brands are trying out for fun. We actually just conducted an internal study on how 3D ads perform in comparison to more classic radio ads. And we saw an increase on the performance for most of the brand metrics, such as brand liking, willingness to talk about the brand, but also, of course, on the Net Promoter Score and the increase in ad liking. So using 3D actually also performs a little better than how a classic audio ad or radio ad would do within the podcast media, that is. And that brings me on to the next thing that I want to cover, which is, as a brand, as a marketer, as a creative agency, whoever I might be, what should I be thinking about when creating ads for the podcast space? So, first of all, I can't say this enough, probably, but 90% of people, they listen to podcasts through headphones. So it's not only an incredibly personal media, it's also an incredibly intimate media, where all other noises are shut out. You've gone into your own little space, you know, with your headphones on, if that is when you're standing ironing your clothes or cooking or out on your power walk, it doesn't matter, you're in your own bubble. And if you compare that to, for example, let's say radio, that's a media that is often consumed through speakers, often in a noisier environment, the car or the office, and as an advertiser, you need to shout to cut through the noise. Whereas in podcasts, you already have 100% of the listener's attention because they're enclosed by that familiar voice that is their favorite podcaster. And this, of course, impacts how you creatively shape the ad creatives that you put in this media. I've written here the perfect podcast ad. I don't have the recipe for the perfect podcast ad, but I think these 4 things might get you a little bit along the way, at least. So first of all, an ad for the podcast media should be spoken word and headphone first. The creative will appear within the realms of a conversation, so the transition between the podcast conversation and the ad needs to be as seamless as possible. And I don't think I have to talk about why headphone first is important, but one thing to think about there is to try to avoid too loud music or intrusive noises, because that can be quite jarring when you're in this, when you're enclosed by the sound, so to speak. Secondly, there's every possibility to really paint a picture with sound, and paint whatever you want to on the canvas of the listener's mind. You can set the scene or the mood with sound and maybe with some light music, and really use that to evoke emotions. If that is a memory of, we all have these sound memories from when we were small that evoke certain emotions. So try to use that. Make silence your friend. This is maybe the most important part. Because silence is that very audible punctuation that allows the listener actually time to stop and reflect on what you have just said and consider that. And just like any good speaker, use that silence intentionally. And then lastly, be personal, because podcasts are an incredibly personal media. We create relationships to the voices that we hear regularly and listen to regularly. And the podcasters, they're also speaking directly to me as a listener. We are having a one-on-one conversation, or at least a one-way conversation. And that's something as a brand that you should also keep in mind when creating ads. So when you're picking your voiceover, make sure it sounds human, it sounds personal, and that their tonality is in line with the conversation that you will be appearing in. And that's what I wanted to be talking to you about today. And to round off, I just want to emphasize the fact that you can close your eyes, but you can't close your ears. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia, for letting us in all that you've learned. And you know, before you came here, we had a conversation, and I said, okay, I'm so curious to know what, since you are an international company, so you're working with all the different markets, and I know that European markets and the different countries do differ. So what I would like to know in the German market and with a German vision on the market, what is very unique from your point of view in Germany and the German podcast market?
I would say the size of the market is very unique. It's the biggest advertising market in the EU, which is my location where I work from on an everyday basis is Sweden, which is like a tiny in comparison. So that of course opens up for fantastic possibilities, both as a creator of a podcast. You can get so many listeners, you can reach so many fans, but also as an advertiser going forward. There is a huge potential in that, I would say.
And are there differences in the, different sort of advertising formats? You know, the German market is very host read driven. It's like the most chosen format in terms of advertisement. Do you see that as a something quite German, and you would work differently in the UK where you have more podcast ads? Is that true, or is it just a feeling that I have?
No, I would say you're quite correct, actually. Looking at Germany specifically and comparing it to example, I would say the UK or Sweden. The UK and Sweden might have come a little further on the podcast journey as markets, both on the creator side but also on the advertiser side. So today I would say ads and sponsorships in the UK and Sweden, they are just as well accepted on both the advertiser side and the creator side. Whereas if we're looking at Germany, and this is something we see in a lot of our newer markets or where we have entered a little more recently, is that acceptance on the creator side for ads is not as high. We see a similar situation in France, for example. But I think that has a lot to do with the unfamiliarity. So, as I said, the host read, that's the classic format that's been around since the beginning of podcasting. And that's not worse or better than anything else. It just has different purposes, the different formats. But I would see, if you're looking forward, I would definitely see that the acceptance for ads is going to increase also in Germany, also because I think advertisers will understand and will want that additional reach that format can add.
Because within Germany, there's this discussion about effectiveness, because the host read has a huge effectiveness for the brand that is actually choosing that format.
Yep.
And you're doing quite a lot of research. Can you see that in the research that you did, that host reads are the most effective, or are podcast ads, if taken seriously, and you sort of had the recipe for the perfect podcast ad, would you say that the effectiveness is sort of the same, or would you say that effectiveness for the host reads is much better still, even though you're working with podcast ads?
I would say the purpose are two very different purposes. Okay. So if I were to recommend a campaign or a set of formats for a client, if they came to me and they're like, okay, so we want to create awareness, we want to reach a lot of people, I would say definitely you should go with an ads campaign. However, if they came to me and they said, I want to build preference, these are our super major target groups. It's, you know, women 35 to 45 with kids. It's young professionals. Okay, maybe I'll pick out a few bigger podcasts within those audiences and do host reads. Maybe also in connection to an ad campaign. If a brand came to me and they said, okay, so we have this core audience and we really want to build brand. We have this cause that we really want to talk to them about. I would recommend them to do a longer format, maybe do a branded episode, or we recently launched a longer sponsorship or a longer host read format this spring, which is a little more creative. You have 4 minutes with the listener, so it's a little bit more time with the listener. That's also something that could be added on. So I would say it depends a lot on what the purpose of your communication are. Because I mean, radio, if you look at radio ads are accepted everywhere in the world, and that is a place where you can't really know who you are reaching. You can a little bit, but not as much as you can when you go into podcasting, because then your ad, you can decide like what is the category, or even what are the shows that I want to be covering with my ad. But of course, this personal recommendation, which is the host read, just like any influencer media, of course it's going to be strong. If I have a close relationship with that podcaster, I'm going to trust him or her. So it's just, I would say, difference depending on what your goal with campaign or communication is.
But you said something very interesting, and I have to admit that I'm a little envious about, you know, when I meet like American colleagues and they tell me about all the tracking techniques that they are having, mentioning Chartable and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So we're not able to do that in Germany because of the laws and the restrictions that we're having with that. Do you have experiences with that? Because like in Europe, we cannot use these techniques, but do you use them like on a global, international basis with the Acast?
So in the US, of course, we're doing a lot of work in that area, and it is, of course, as of now mainly available in the US, and there that's also where a lot of focus is, because we do have GDPR in the EU, which, I mean, you can hate it and you can love it
At the same time.
At the same time, right? But what we do have, which is global, is that Acast is certified by the IAB. So, and we're the only podcast company today that's certified on all 4 parameters. So, how we measure an impression, how we measure a listen, how we measure a unique listen, is standardized on a global scale. So that's something that we like all adhere to, and which is, you know, a very big stride forward for the whole podcasting industry, I would say, to have this unified currency for measuring listens and impressions.
Yeah, but still, I would love to have these tracking devices as well.
Yeah, of course, of course.
So, Sophia, thank you so much for coming to Munich and being with us.
Yeah.
I have to say that Frank Kretschmer from AdSwiss wasn't able to come here because he got ill, so that's why it was even more eventful to have you here, because you said that you would talk to us a little bit longer, and I thank you so much for being so flexible. Thank you.
Thank you.
And until later.